think of the Kennedy assassination, first word that comes to mind is cover-up.
Well, pragmatically, I really believe that John F. Kennedy was assassinated by one lone assassin.
There was more than one person involved in the incident.
I think it was probably engineered by the mob.
I don't think he was a lone assassin at all.
No, I don't think Oswald did it.
I feel it was a conspiracy, yes. And it was a sad day.
No, I don't believe he did it alone. I believe there is a cover-up with the government. I believe the FBI or CIA was involved in it 100%. I believe Cuba was involved in it.
Harvey Oswald was not alone.
Lyndon Baines Johnson was involved in that conspiracy.
Well, I've heard that theory before, but I don't know if I believe it or not.
I wouldn't doubt any part of the government because they're all a bunch of liars and thieves and con artists.
Emotionally, I want to believe there was a conspiracy.
There's a lot of things that I think are unanswered. A lot of us have a lot of questions.
On November 22nd, 31 years ago today, someone shot and killed President John F. Kennedy in Dallas, Texas. A federal commission concluded a lone gunman did it, but in the years since, millions of people have come to doubt that conclusion.
San Jose man claims that he has solved the mystery that's kept our nation spellbound for these past 31 years.
My name is Kal Korff, and I've been studying the subject for 17 years. I know that there are over 4,000 books on the Kennedy assassination, and everybody's wandering around claiming that they have the answer to what happened over 30 years ago. But I'd like to believe that based on the reaction that we've received from our study, as well as just the history of it, that what we've been able to do in our investigation of the assassination is a little bit unique. I'll give you some reasons why. In 1978 and 1977, when I was a freshman in high school, I decided to do an extra credit report on the Kennedy assassination. Coincidentally, I had been attending John F. Kennedy High School in Fremont, California. In order to save time for the report, I asked my teachers who it was who had killed him, and was shocked to find out that every teacher I asked gave me a different answer. That kind of rubbed me the wrong way. I couldn't make any sense of it, and we started looking into the case as this extra credit report was evolving. And 218 pages later, we finished the report. My teacher was a little bit shocked. We concluded and found evidence of an individual in Dealey Plaza that day who was on the grassy knoll who should not have been there. We, in particular, used a NASA computer to locate that individual and confirm that that person was really there. And what happened to me after this event took place is what caused me to stay fascinated with the case and to investigate it to this very day. What had happened is when we found the evidence of a person on the grassy knoll who should not have been there, it made the media. In fact, here are some newspaper clippings of some of the media coverage that came out at the time. This is the San Jose Mercury News. This other clipping here is from Stanford University. Well, the following Monday, after these newspaper clippings started to appear in the paper, I was hauled out of school, and there was an investigator for the United States government on the phone, and he asked me to turn over the data. We sent the data into the United States government. We were told about 6 weeks later that we were wrong, that there was no guy on the knoll, that it was a scratch on the film, and basically that we were wrong. Being someone who was just getting into computers, I already knew that that was not possible. The computer could certainly tell the difference between a scratch on a piece of film and a three-dimensional object that is really there. So it was our government's treatment of my particular involvement, at least, in the JFK assassination that really rubbed me the wrong way. What I didn't know at the time is that our government was reinvestigating the case in the House Assassination Committee years. And they, of course, later concluded that there was probably a conspiracy. So here is the same branch, the same congressional committee, telling me that our photos, our analysis of a certain photo does not show a man on the knoll. Yet a few months later, they conclude that there was a conspiracy and that there was a man on the knoll that was shooting. That kind of, again, rubbed me the wrong way because from my point of view, you can't have it both ways. So what I decided to do at that point was to study the assassination very quietly, to spend whatever time it took to learn as much as I could about it. I never thought, honestly, ever, that I would figure it out. I thought this would be one of those mysteries that would never be solved. However, in late 1992, my company, TotalResearch, in our opinion, we solved the assassination. And we deliberately waited a year to release the information because we wanted to see what additional data was going to come out, because we knew that the publishers were going to release a ton of titles trying to capitalize on the 30th anniversary of the assassination. We also knew additional material was being declassified by the government. And since we had felt that we had the answer, we wanted to see if any new information would come out, including from the Soviet Union, to see if it would torpedo our findings. None of it did. And what we're going to do is reenact the assassination. And I think what differentiates our study from everyone else's is that ours is the only conclusion that you can go home yourself and independently verify. Now, how did we do this? We simply took every book ever published on the assassination, every photograph taken, every movie taken, every unpublished manuscript we could get our hands on, every CIA, FBI, NSA document we could locate. And for 17 years now, we've been putting these into our computers. Tomorrow I will bring in my Macintosh computer, and rather than take my word for it, we will analyze any photos that you want to analyze. We'll address any issues you want to discuss. So I think what's exciting about our study is that you don't have to take our word for it. You can go home, and especially if you own a personal computer, whether it be an IBM, a PowerPC, or Macintosh, you can verify the results yourselves. Now, what is it that we concluded? Well, without sounding too much like a schmuck, I can't really go into detail in about 20 minutes. It takes a little longer than that. It takes a lot longer, actually. But again, the bottom line is that you don't have to accept our word for it. You can go home and check this stuff yourself. We have studied every book from Case Closed, which was a bestseller last year, among other titles, to the original Warren Report. We've corrected all the errors. We'll be going through the Zapruder film, through the relevant frames. That includes everything from when the first shot was fired to the fatal headshot. You will actually see the moment that the bullet went through Governor Connolly and President Kennedy, which is visible on the enhancements. And we will also be going over issues of what it was that people saw on the grassy knoll that caused them to run up on the hill and look for another assassin that was never located. Okay? We'll go over the eyewitness testimonies that have been very popular over the years. We will also show you who it was on the grassy knoll at the time, which can be determined by analyzing these particular photos. The 4 charters of responsibility that TotalResearch has is philosophy and religion, science and technology, political and social issues, and history, and archaeology. We put the Kennedy assassination under both history and political and social issues because 9 out of 10 people believe there was a conspiracy. If you were to ask 9 out of 10 people whether they believed in God, you wouldn't find a number that high. Yet 9 out of 10 people believe there was a conspiracy. It doesn't really matter whether there was or wasn't one when you look at that question. What matters is that for whatever reasons, 9 out of 10 people have a certain opinion that is either agreed upon or united. TotalResearch has a charter within those 4 areas to study humankind's most enduring and challenging phenomenon. That's why we study everything from UFOs to who it was who killed President Kennedy. Because we believe that the more we know about these subjects, the more answers we know to these questions, the better off we are as a society. Let's take UFOs, for example. It doesn't matter whether they exist or not, from the standpoint that if they don't exist, then we've got a problem, because on a mass scale, meaning on a planet-wide basis, there's obviously millions of people that must be hallucinating, and we have nothing to lose by knowing about that truth. The same is true about who killed President Kennedy. If it was a conspiracy, the ramifications are very bad. If it wasn't a conspiracy, then why is it that everyone has the belief that there is? I will tell you that most of the people that I have encountered over the years, their opinions of the assassination are based on facts and evidence that they've been exposed to. But what we did in our study is we went back to those original sources of evidence and was able to separate the truth from the fiction. This overview of the analysis, the computer enhancements showing the views through the rifle, timing sequences, stills and the exact moments and frames that Governor Connally was wounded, President Kennedy was wounded, which all tie into whether there was a second gunman or not, or how many shots were fired. And then photos that have never been published before in any Kennedy book ever are of the actual forensic evidence. The motivation for the study was to get to the truth. I felt that when we got to that truth, it would have been a shame to keep it all to ourselves, and that's why we are releasing the data. The motivation for doing this is to release the information to the public. It's not driven by a desire to make a ton of money or do something like Oliver Stone did, but it's more to confront an issue that I grew up with as a kid, even though I was only 18 months old at the time when President Kennedy was assassinated. And I think it's probably safe to say that everyone since that time, ever since that murder happened, has been affected in one way or another. Certainly the American political system has. We found a person on the knoll who, by all previous accounts, that person had not been there. Our computer analysis that we did at NASA at the time, back in 1977, when computer image enhancement processing was just coming into its own commercially at the declassified level, showed that the object was three-dimensional, showed that there was an object in the person's hand, etc., etc. And of course the committee later concluded that there was a gunman on the knoll and that second assassin had fired a pistol based on the acoustical match. So we used edge enhancement, false color contouring, and a three-dimensional object that is in a photograph simply does not profile the same way that a scratch on a film does, which is two-dimensional and is only surface level. So we were using those tests to, tell whether this was real or not. Okay. We've been told, and it's our opinion, of course, that the assassination has now been solved, and that every outstanding or significant aspect of it that was previously unexplained has now been explained. The key to figuring out what happened with President Kennedy, in our opinion, was to go back and start over. In other words, don't accept the Warren Commission's report, don't accept what Gerald Posner says in Case Closed, don't accept the House Assassinations Committee report. We threw all of that stuff out, started over, and under the assumption that a fact is a fact and that anybody should be able to go back and independently check it and verify it, that's the only criteria we had in our analysis and investigation. So I want to stress to you that although some of the stuff you're about to hear today I think will be a little hard to accept at first, I think if you take a little time and go with me over the reasons why, how it happened, is what I'm going to tell you, then I think you'll be in a position to not only check it out yourself, but I think a whole lot of intrigue and mystery will be very clear. Okay, how many of you, first, this is just a curiosity question for myself, how many of you believe there was a conspiracy to kill President Kennedy? Raise your hands. Okay, how many of you don't believe there was a conspiracy? Okay, so everyone in this room believes there was a conspiracy. All right, you're not alone. 90% of all Americans believe the same thing. And there's nothing wrong with that belief, because based on the data that everyone has had to work with, it's a very valid conclusion. The problem, however, is that the data everyone has had to work with has not been accurate. For example, I'll ask you guys, what is the biggest problem that you have with the assassination? Is the biggest problem with the magic bullet theory? The idea that one bullet can go through two people, cause all those wounds, and end up with, no damage to the bullet? Is that the main reason? Why is it that you guys believe there was a conspiracy?
Witnesses who heard and saw, rifle smoke, flash of light. Oswald had no nitrates, and it seemed improbable for him to be able to do the shooting, as he was not a terrific shot.
Mm-hmm.
It was an impossible shot with one rifle. For him to get down the stairs, drinking a Coke, relaxed, unconcerned.
Sounds like you've read a little bit about it. Yeah. No, you're rattling off a bunch of details, of course, which have been used to build the case that there's a conspiracy. Yes, sir.
There's also the issue of the witness of the deaf-mute who...
Ed Hoffman, yeah.
Yeah, who saw the puff of smoke and the rifleman, the two men behind the wall of the grassy knoll.
Okay. So you're referring to Ed Hoffman and witnesses like Gene Hill,
yeah,
who saw men fire at the president and they got away behind the knoll. Okay.
There's also the Secret Service agent who
Didn't belong
who didn't belong there, who identified himself to the policeman, and then no one could ever
figure out who he
figure out
was.
who he was again.
Right. Okay, and you, sir?
And then there's also the driver who stopped the vehicle right at the scene.
Mr. Greer, the Secret Service agent.
Yeah, which is the most illogical thing, according to their training, to do.
Right.
It was as though he was saying, if you missed him on the first two, I'll slow down so you can do it right.
Mm-hmm.
One is that there's the evidence suggesting the final shot from the front being from a fragmenting bullet. There was also a report that I saw on I think it was on Discovery investigative reports. They had enhancements of a photograph showing a man in a uniform who then came forward and he said, I took some pictures, they were confiscated from me, and it was a man who came from behind me dressed in a police officer's uniform who had a big gun, and he threatened me to turn over my camera.
That was Gordon Arnold, the soldier that was on leave, that hit the dirt because a shot had come over past his right ear, I think.
Actually, I believe it may be someone, he said he was standing directly in front of the grassy knoll,
right,
and felt a bullet whiz past his ear, and then someone came from the same direction carrying a rifle and took his camera away from him.
Right.
What's interesting is that there was a picture taken from the opposite side of the street. Once enhanced, seems to show not only the assailant, the so-called badge person,
right,
but this man in the uniform.
Yeah, once you enhance the photo, he's been called Badge Man because it looks like he's wearing a Dallas police uniform.
But I'm also saying that, that this witness seems to be identified as well, a man in a military uniform who was then sent to Alaska and never heard from again until now.
Right. We start with, in our study of the assassination, let's go ahead and talk about, first of all, the presidential motorcade route. This is an area that we studied quite a lot, and it's the first chapter in the book that we're working on. It turns out that the presidential motorcade route had been determined by one of President Kennedy's advisors, and it was a few days before the actual assassination took place where they had actually pinpointed the actual route that was going to turn in front of the depository. The original route that was planned called for the Main Street to be used instead of Elm, but when they discovered there was a curb in the way and that the limousine couldn't go over the curb, that's when it was altered at the last minute. So as far as the route is concerned for the motorcade, it was obviously set, it was approved by the White House, and then of course President Kennedy was in the limousine and then he was killed. Now, what about the assassination itself? We know that at least 3 shots were fired, and we know that at least 1 shot hit Governor Connally. We know that at least 2 shots hit President Kennedy. And we, of course, know the outcome of what happened to President Kennedy. Now, what I would like to do is go over the assassination itself and debunk some myths about it. Then we'll immediately jump to the moment after the assassination where people, like you mentioned, Gordon Arnold and Gene Hill and Ed Hoffman, had seen other people behind the fence and the evidence for a grassy knoll gunman. So let's get our volunteers here. President Kennedy is going to sit here. Jackie Kennedy is going to sit here. Governor Connolly here, and his wife here. One thing real clear. If you look in most of the assassination literature, you will see a diagram that is labeled the remarkable path of the magic bullet, okay? And what it shows you is it shows President Kennedy sitting in front of Governor Connolly sitting in front of President Kennedy, and it shows how the bullet, you know, went down from the angle of the depository, made a right angle turn after exiting out of Kennedy, then went into Governor Connolly's back. Dr. Cyril Wecht, who's a forensic pathologist and the chief coroner for Allegheny County in Pittsburgh, is the person who originated that drawing. It's also the same drawing that you see in the movie JFK, and it has appeared in numerous books. That drawing is wrong, and here's why. In the presidential limousine, the seats are not aligned directly in front of each other. You can look in any photograph taken of the limousine, and even to today that is true. Because in the very back seat here, you have the back seat, which is quite long. In the front, you have what are called two jump seats, which are temporary seating if in the event that extra people are riding in the limousine. They are aligned slightly to the left. When Dr. Wecht looked at the Zapruder film, and it didn't even notice, and you can see when you look at it that the seats are not aligned in front of each other, he took a two-dimensional image, the frame from the Zapruder film, did a drawing of it. He should have converted it into 3D space when he did his drawing. That would have shown the correct alignment. So no matter whether there was one gunman or two or three who killed Kennedy, it doesn't matter. The bottom line is that the angle that he used was wrong, and the bullet did not make a right angle turn. The idea that a bullet would make a right angle turn is ridiculous anyway, but I just want you to know that that drawing is not correct. Okay? And we have an issue of whether Lee Harvey Oswald's rifle could go ahead and fire 3 shots in 6 seconds. That is, of course, very hard to do. In fact, the truth is no marksman to this day has ever duplicated the feat that Oswald was convicted in his death of having done. The Mannlicher Carcano rifle that Oswald used was manufactured during World War II, and the ammunition that he used had also come from World War II as well. It was surplus ammunition. So not only was the ammunition a couple of decades old at the time, but the rifle itself took a fair amount of practice in order to be comfortable with it. And one thing Oswald was noted for, and this is based on everyone who knew him, from his wife to his friends, is he always was seen working the bolt. In fact, his friends reported quite a lot that Oswald had forearm muscles that were pretty strong, which is the muscles needed to work the bolt a lot. So Oswald was always working this bolt all the time. He would sit on his patio and dry fire and test. So when the Warren Commission took the Mannlicher Carcano rifle or other equivalent rifles and handed it to a marksman who was a great shot but had never used the rifle before and said, here, fire at a stationary target and see if you can bang off 3 shots in 6 seconds, well, that's a stupid test to do. Scientifically, it's worthless. The person has to be comfortable with the rifle, especially the bolt, because that's where your time is going to be eaten up. And then Kennedy wasn't sitting still. Although the limousine did slow down, its average speed was about 11 miles an hour, and it was a moving target that was receding away. So to fire at a stationary target with a strange rifle is not a valid test, but that's what they did anyway. Well, let's debunk another myth. I will show you evidence which anyone has yet to refute that there weren't 6 seconds in the assassination. The total time was about 8.5 seconds. Now, the 6-second myth is courtesy of the Warren Report. The Warren Commission concluded that no assassin would have fired at the presidential limousine until after the limousine cleared the trees that were obscuring the view from the 6th floor depository window down on the presidential limousine. So that translates into roughly frame 181 of the Zapruder film. Since the Zapruder film is already 181 frames into its time sequence, if you will, the assumption that nobody fired until after the limousine cleared the trees meant that there was only about 6 seconds to get the job done. We'll now see evidence very shortly that the first shot occurred around frame 160 or frame 161, and if you add up the total time there, it equals roughly 8.5 seconds. Now, one other thing too, it may be 3 shots in 8.5 seconds, not 6, but it's not cocking the bolt 3 times in that time frame. You have to remember that the first shot is already ready to go. So within 8.5 seconds after the first shot, Oswald, or the assassin, only has to work the bolt twice. That's it. And you can actually take your time a little bit. In other words, 8.5 seconds to cock the bolt twice and fire can be done without being in too much of a hurry. Yes?
Okay, it's already cocked. The first shot has to come when the view is unobscured by the trees. So
That's
you
correct.
can't add the 2 seconds on based on the presumption of his firing 3 shots in 8 seconds. He wouldn't fire 2 seconds into the trees.
No. What we're establishing and what I'm going to show you is evidence that the first shot occurred before the limousine went under the tree.
That's all right.
The second and third shots occurred after it had emerged from the tree,
That's
whereas the
okay, too.
Warren report said all 3 shots occurred after it had cleared the tree. And since we know the moment of the fatal shot, that's not disputed. That's where the 6 versus 8.5 second window occurs. Yes, sir.
Why wouldn't Oswald fire dead on when the limo was coming down Houston Street before it took the turn on Elm?
Because if you...
As the target was getting progressively closer to him.
Because if he had missed, the limousine could have sped right past the depository. And if you're going to ambush somebody, the best time to shoot them is as they turn down and they're receding away from you, because they can't get away from you. They may speed away, but you can still get off 2 or 3 more shots before the target is out of sight. If he had missed the first shot, they would have sped directly past the depository and President Kennedy would still be alive. But once he committed to that turn, there was a stretch of road that he was an open target. So even if the first shot or even the second shot missed, there was still room to get off a third, maybe a 4th shot. And you have to remember that when the rifle was found, there was a bullet in the chamber that was ejected. So that meant that the bolt was cocked again for a 4th shot. But Oswald, or whoever had the rifle, obviously didn't fire it.
Why did they never find a clip?
They did find a clip. It's visible in several photographs taken that day. In fact, you can go to the National Archives and view the clip and hold it. Honestly. Sylvia Meager is responsible for the myth that there's no clip. She first publicized that fact in the book Accessories After the Fact, and it is incorrect.
Well, if that were true, frame 181 would have shown him shot, right? Because that was the first frame after the view.
No, because that's assuming that he fired the moment. The Warren Commission is saying that the first shot occurred around then. We're not saying that. I'm simply pointing out how the Warren Commission boxed itself in by only giving themselves 6 seconds. In other words, instead of saying, let's not come to any conclusions, let's just look at the data and see what the data tells us, they said, well, nobody would shoot until after he was clear from the tree. So that assumption itself is an assumption, and yet it gets treated as a fact, and it boxed them in. And in our investigation, we said, we're throwing everybody's data out. Let's see what the data itself says. Let's make no assumptions.
How many shots were fired?
How many shots were fired?
Yeah.
3.
Only 3?
Only 3, and I'll show you why in a few minutes. When you look at this mural here, what you're going to see, okay, we have various enlargements here that I'll show you in a moment, is you're going to see along here a woman who's running along. She has a red pants on, okay, and you'll notice that as she's running along, she suddenly stops, okay, so she's running along this way, and then she suddenly stops and looks back towards the depository. Now that woman at the time was a little lady who was the daughter of a major who was taking photographs of the assassination at the time. The press interviewed the parents and not the girl. And Major Phil Willis said, well, my daughter stopped running when I yelled to her to stop. Well, when you talk to the Linda Willis, the major's daughter, she said, I didn't even hear my father yelling at me. I stopped when I heard the first shot. And you see, as she's running along, when she suddenly stops, you will see in the Zapruder film that President Kennedy and Governor Connolly are starting to go ahead and look to the left and to the right to try to find out what is going on. The first row of photographs that you see up in the mural, you can see her running along there. You'll also see that she has stopped and she has like this incredulous look on her face, like she can't believe what she's seeing. And she is looking back up at the 6th floor depository window, and she is seeing somebody firing at the president. The Zapruder film also shows that her father is still taking pictures of the limousine at the time that he claims he yelled out to his daughter. So his recollection is wrong. Now, if we know the moment of the first shot, which we can assume because the woman's running along at full speed and then she stops because she hears the noise, that puts it at frame 160 and 161 of the Zapruder film, not after the limousine has cleared the branches of the tree. It in fact occurs just before the limousine is obscured by the branches. So there's evidence to indicate, and there are other eyewitness testimonies, that there was a spark that was seen in front of the limousine that indicates that the shot had missed, at least the first shot. There's also evidence too, based on the curb, the nick in the curb that was found 500 feet away that wounded James Tague, that the shot had been deflected. And a spectrographic analysis of the metal found in the curb showed that it was the core of the bullet and not the jacket that hit. And the core only separates from the jacket if the bullet strikes something. Now, when you look at the view of frame 160 to 161 as it was filmed through Oswald's rifle was sighted 4 inches high and to the right, which means the scope was not, calibrated. A lot of people have said, well, that's evidence that, it's even harder to hit your target. Well, yes and no. If your target is moving away from you or going from left to right, in order to shoot at a moving target, you have to do what they call lead it. You have to lead it, as in you have to aim a little bit ahead of the target in order to hit it. Well, if your rifle is sighted 4 inches to the right and high like this, you don't need to lead your target. Because you're not calibrated anyway, there's an automatic lead that happens. So we know that Oswald, or when the rifle was fired, that although it wasn't calibrated to hit the target, it didn't require that a person familiar with it would have to lead it.
Are you saying that was an accident?
No, I'm not saying it was an accident. I'm simply qualifying that, no, we don't know why the scope wasn't calibrated. I'm simply qualifying the fact that it was not necessary to lead the target. This is also something that the marksmen who were asked to duplicate Oswald's feet were never told. They were never told that the sighting was off and that they didn't need to lead the target. So when they led the target, thinking it was calibrated, they of course missed the target. And that went in the record books as proof that, the feet couldn't be duplicated.
I thought the FBI had to shim the scope up before they could even test it.
No, the FBI later on put a little shimmy under the scope so they could calibrate it. But initially, that is not how the tests were done. Okay?
What's the point?
Well, the point being that the Mannlicher Carcano rifle has been bad-mouthed, if you will, that it's an inaccurate, cheap weapon. It can't hit its target. Oswald was a poor shot, but that was most likely due to his dyslexia, not because he didn't have enough practice with the weapon.
That's what I'm thinking. A scope could be off any number of degrees, and if you work with it long enough, you can compensate what you want. Sure.
Exactly.
So in all of his times of sitting there, cocking it, and everything else, he surely must have had time to fire it a few times to discover what its offage was.
Yeah. I mean, of all the people in the world who was most familiar with that rifle, there's no doubt it was Oswald. Now, whether he used it or not to actually kill the president, we'll find out shortly. So what we've...
On your
yes,
point
sir.
there, I mean, he'd have to, in order for that theory to work, he would have to practice with a moving target in order to calibrate his scope, and he'd have to practice with it that way. What scenario...
No, he doesn't have to practice, because if Oswald did kill the president, okay, it wasn't until a few days before the actual visit that Oswald was in a position to know that the limousine was going to pass right under him. He had just been hired at the depository a few weeks earlier. So unless Oswald was in on some conspiracy from day one, before even the White House knew where Kennedy was going to be, they had only planned the trip to Miami at that point. They had not confirmed that it was going to be Dallas. I mean, Lyndon Johnson had already been there. So what I'm getting at is he didn't necessarily have, you don't have to practice, in other words. In other words, Oswald had practice with it. Remember, it was shown that he did take a shot at General Walker. A lot of people forget that. And Walker was moving around, although he was sitting on his desk, when the shot went off. And the shot barely missed Walker by a couple of inches. It grazed his head.
Well, that wasn't proven. That was alleged.
No, it was proven. It was proven with neutron activation analysis of the bullets. You can actually get the lab reports and check them yourselves. When the initial report came out by the government in 1964, it was not proven. It was implied. Neutron activation analysis was brand new. But that test has been done twice now on the neutron activation analysis, and it was shown that the weapon did come from the Carcano, and it was from the same ammunition batch.
But doesn't it, yeah, the same ammunition batch could be, what was it, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of rounds?
No. The ammunition manufactured by the Western Cartridge Company for the Carcanos was a peculiar mix of lead and antimony. So if you had, the ratios were not consistent in the batch, but there was a consistency as far as what I'll call, well, how do you say it? Normally when you do a neutron activation analysis of, say, bullets, you can tell whether they're from the same batch of ammunition or not, okay, because there tends to be the same degrees of impurities per lot that they make. In the Western Cartridge ammunition, it's just the opposite, okay? What they're able to show is an inconsistency as far as lead versus antimony versus copper for the jacket that tends to be done per lot. And because the ammunition was only manufactured from 1942 through 1947 before they stopped it, because a lot of these weapons were unloaded in the United States as Italian war surplus weapons, there were only so many rounds made, and then they haven't been produced since. And the neutron activation analysis showed that the bullet that was recovered from the wall in Walker's study was from the same batch that was made from which Oswald had, you know, the cartridges from the weapon. So now we know that the first shot occurred earlier than the Warren Commission says. It occurred earlier than the House Committee says. And of course we know when the last frame was, the fatal headshot at frame number 313. So if we have one shot around frame 160 and at least a third shot around frame 13, what about the shot that first wounded President Kennedy and Governor Connolly? And here's where some of this stuff may be a little hard for you guys to believe, but again, this stuff can all be independently checked.
It's all on the presumption that there were no frames removed. That was one of the rumors that I heard.
There were 3 frames removed from the Zapruder film. A very dumb reason as to why it happened. When Time Life got one of the copies of the film, there were 3 copies actually made, 2 of the original. They gave one of the print copies, the one that the Warren Commission ended up with later, to a junior photo technician who, when he was working on the film, he damaged 3 frames. They were later deleted and the 2 parts were spliced back together. In fact, if you own, for example, the Laserdisc version of Oliver Stone's movie JFK, you will see that that's the version they've been using, because just at the point where Willis stops and turns around, you see the top half of her body, and then you see her gone suddenly. I have the 3 frames at home. They were actually also published in Josiah Thompson's book, 6 Seconds in Dallas, so they have been accounted for. Also, the original Zapruder film and one of the copies that was made before this other copy was damaged are also available. So the frames aren't missing anymore, but during the time of the Warren Commission investigation they were, and unfortunately the Warren Commission didn't seem to want to hunt down the 3 frames, but they are accounted for. For President Kennedy, we know that one of the shots hit him in the back here. The issue has been, well, was he hit at the base of the neck, or was he hit lower down in the middle of the spine? When I debated Gate and Fonzie on Larry King Live last November 22nd, Gate and Fonzie was arguing that the hole in the jacket of President Kennedy's, jacket, the bullet hole, was too far down and did not match the hole that's visible in the back of his neck in the autopsy photos. Well, President Kennedy was leaning forward at the time as they began to be obscured by that little sign, okay? And when he was leaning forward as well, Kennedy also had raised his hands a little bit, his right hand. You got to remember, he was waving to the crowd to the left and to the right. He only interrupted that after the first shot because he was trying to find out what was going on. Most people reported that that first shot sounded like a firecracker, not like a normal, not like the second and the third shots. Okay, Kennedy also wore a back brace and an ace bandage. And although he was a very well-tailored president, he actually became fascist or fashion conscious of fashions after he married Jackie. This part under here, both the shirt and the jacket, were bunched up a little bit. Now just a little bit, not a lot, okay? So when the bullet came down this way, once you compensate for the arm being raised, you see that the holes do line up. But a more important issue isn't where the hole is in the jacket, because a hole in a jacket doesn't prove anything. It's more, where did the bullet go after it entered President Kennedy? All right? Now, if it exited his body, there's a problem here, because there's somebody in the way, Governor Connolly. Now, what is Governor Connolly doing as the second shot comes down? Well, after the first shot, Governor Connolly is looking to the right and to the left to try to find out what the source of the sound is, because he thought the first sound was definitely from a rifle, and Connolly was an avid hunter. So Connolly turned to the right to try to see the president out of his eye, at the corner of his eye, and he never saw him. He then started to turn to his left. Go ahead and turn to your left. And when the second shot hit, okay, Connolly was at an angle. And we know that the bullet entered Governor Connolly from the back.
The right side of the back?
It was the right side of the back.
Oh.
And we know that the length of the bullet, the length of the entrance wound was 6.6 millimeters. Okay? In other words, the length of the wound, excuse me, I have that backwards. The length of the wound, the entrance wound into Governor Connolly's back, was 1 millimeter longer than the length of the bullet. Now that's very important, and it's something nobody seems to focus on. And here's why. A bullet, when it travels out of a gun, and a .45 is an exception to this rule, because there's this grooving in the barrel, the bullet tends to turn this way, spin around. So when it enters somebody, the width of the hole is usually roughly the size of the width of the bullet. A bullet usually doesn't enter sideways unless it tumbles. And bullets only tumble as they lose velocity or if they go through something else first. Now, who is in a position to have something go through him first before hitting the second person? That is obviously President Kennedy, Governor Connolly. So, in President Kennedy's back, we have a nice, neat hole. The bullet exits out this way, between the muscles in his neck. It grazes the C6 vertebrae. But by the time it slams into Governor Connolly, it's not a neat hole. The entire length of the bullet, plus 1 millimeter, is the size of the wound in his back. That proves the bullet tumbled. Again, let's say President Kennedy wasn't here, and all we had was the wound on Governor Connolly. The fact that it was a wound that was a tear like this is due to the angle, as well as the fact that the bullet tumbled. And it tumbled because it hit Kennedy first. Now, once it entered Governor Connolly, it bounced off his 5th rib and exited below the right nipple here. He was holding his Stetson hat up here like this the whole time. He never dropped it in the limousine. It then exited and hit his wrist, bounced out here, and ended up in his thigh, breaking the skin and causing some blood. But they never found the bullet until later at Parkland Hospital. And the issue is, was this the real bullet or was it a planted bullet? And could this bullet that was never damaged cause all these injuries? There are 7 separate injuries. Governor Connolly suffering the worst of it, with Kennedy just having the bullet come in and out of the neck muscle. Well, there's a couple of issues on that. A Mannlicher Carcano bullet travels at a speed in excess of 2,000 feet per second. You can get on the phone and call anyone in the military and ask them if we ourselves as a nation has ever had a rifle issued to our troops that fires a bullet that fast. The answer is no. You can take a Mannlicher Carcano bullet and fire it through 2 feet of solid pine wood, and that bullet will not be damaged. Now, how do we know whether it was one bullet or whether it was the so-called magic bullet? Well, first of all, most of the photographs of the magic bullet are deceptive because they've conveniently rolled the bullet to one side to photograph it, so it doesn't betray the fact that it's pretty flat. And if you don't believe me, go to the National Archives and look at the bullet yourself. Anybody can do it. You can even see Oswald's rifle, and if you want, they'll even bring out President Kennedy's bloody shirt with the hole in the back. All of that stuff is available. You just have to sign, show your ID, and it's free, okay? So the photographs that a lot of people have seen are, you know, shall we say, a little selective on the magic bullet.
Why? I don't get the significance of the phrase magic bullet.
Well, that's what it's known as, the magic bullet. That's its nickname. The one they found.
On the gurney in the hospital?
Yes.
Okay. Which some allege was planted there?
Yeah, some allege it was planted. What we're trying to do is settle the issue of, could that bullet have caused all of this stuff and, you know, still emerge intact the way it did. But once again, once you see the bullet, it's a lot more mangled than the photograph. In other words, because it's flat on one side, if you turn it over, it's round on the other. That's the side that's been photographed, even by the National Archives, unfortunately. Okay, so here we have a bullet entering at about 2,000 feet per second. Because it grazed Kennedy's spine, it exited at about 1,700 feet per second. When it slammed into Governor Connolly, we know that it tumbled because of the size of the hole of the entrance wound, which was larger than the exit wound in President Kennedy's throat. When it entered here at 1,700 feet per second, by the time it bounced off the wrist, or the rib cage, and exited out here in the wrist, it was traveling about 1,400 feet per second, maybe as little as 1,200 feet per second. There's about a 200 feet per second leeway in the calculations. By the time it entered here and exited, it had slowed down to about 400 to 600 feet per second. And if any of you have ever played paintball, that's paintball speed. Enough to break the skin and cause a little bruise, maybe some blood, but not enter the skin and leave a bullet lodged in your leg. Okay?
What about the bullet fragments in his knee that have never been removed?
Okay, most of those fragments, those little dots on the x-ray, those are bone chips. Those are not metallic fragments. In fact, the doctors who operated on Governor Connolly left one fragment in there and noted it at the time. They asked the governor, do you want this removed? You're not going to feel it. It's a small piece. Governor Connolly didn't really care. He was also half out of it at the time. So they left the one fragment in there. But when you look at the x-rays, and you see all those little white specks, those are bone chips. Those are not bullet fragments.
Which knee are we talking about?
I'm sorry, the left one, the left leg.
It went from his right wrist to his left knee?
Yes, because it was reflected off on the bone in here.
But still, if it's traveling what did you say, 400 to 600 feet per second at that?
Well, at the time, it left here and went into the leg. See, Governor Connolly never had a bullet in his leg. He just had the skin broken and some blood, and there was one fragment, a tiny piece of metal sliver, and some debris, some hair and debris from the exit of the shirt. Because the shirts themselves showed that the fibers were pushed out from the front and pushed in from the rear, proving that the bullet went from back to front.
But still, after striking his wrist, it seems like it's almost dropping, as if there's no velocity to the bullet. It seems that the bullet would have continued in it.
No, because when it hit the wrist here, okay, look at the wrist here. The wrist is not, there's two bones in here, and there's a gap between the bones, all right? And the way Governor Connolly was holding his Stetson, when you look at enhancements of the Zapruder film, at the time he gets shot, you see him do this with his wrist. And that is the moment that the bullet actually struck. And even though he struck it, he never went ahead and dropped the hat the entire time. The argument's been used that, well, it couldn't have been one bullet, it couldn't have hit the wrist it did because it didn't shatter the radius, and he never dropped his hat. Well, he never dropped his hat, period. So the issue's irrelevant. In other words, to use the hat as a signal that, well, a bullet did this is invalid because he never dropped his hat. But what you do see after the moment that he was shot is you do see his wrist go like that. And then, because the bullet had pierced the lung and had hit the rib cage and bounced out, the moment Connolly took his next breath caused his lung to collapse because it had been lacerated by the bullet. Now, what proof do we have that this is actually what happened? Well, the Zapruder film tells us, and this is something that has been looked at for years and has been missed by a lot of people.